In one single scene, Game of Thrones perfectly displays why Robert Baratheon is oblivious, negligent, and flat out delusional. But they also captured that Robert is 100% right about at least one thing, and before the end of this video, we'll definitely touch on that. So this is King Robert, and this is Queen Cersei, and well, this is Dan Benioff and DB Weiss. Look, they wrote this episode, they wrote this scene, and I know a lot of people are not huge fans in how they handled the last half of Game of Thrones, but since I'm going to be praising this scene they wrote, I think it is important to recognize that at one point, they really did get it. This is not from the books, this scene is 100% original to the show Game of Thrones. So back to Robert and Cersei. This scene takes place shortly after Ned Stark essentially quits as Hand of the King because of the dispute about the decision to kill Daenerys Targaryen when they discover that she is pregnant. And Robert has some interesting things to say here that are consistent with things he shares with Ned in the book and show, and we're going to cover that here in just a second because there's two parts to this scene. One is focused on Robert's concern about a potential Targaryen return with the Dothraki, but the other half is dedicated to a much more intimate conversation. Cersei suggests that the entire realm is basically held together with the union of their marriage, and it's a humorous scene, but it's a statement that I don't entirely agree with, but if you think Cersei is right, tell me why in the comments. Anyway, this progresses into Cersei, for the very first time, asking about Lyanna Stark. Robert is puzzled, and he doesn't really know why she's asking. This should be a very vulnerable moment for Cersei, but if you listen to what she says here, you'll hear why it doesn't really matter much to her, at least not anymore.
That's just saying her name, even in private. I felt like I was breathing life back into her. I thought if I didn't talk about her, she'd just fade away for you. When I realized that wasn't going to happen, I refused to ask out of spite. I didn't want to give you the satisfaction of thinking I cared enough to ask.
Cersei, like any other girl of noble birth, just marries whoever her father betroths her to, and yet she wants her husband to want her. The denial of that affection from Robert has built up this spitefulness in her, and when that seemed to do nothing, it left her no choice but to resign herself to the fact that this is just how things are. Meanwhile, she does have her incestuous relationships with Jaime, among others. I mean, she is a very flawed character after all, but this is the most raw and sincere we get to see her character, at least up until this point. The one thing about this scene for Cersei, even in an arranged marriage, this scene does display how complex and elusive emotions are for all of these characters. They describe their relationship as hatred. Of course, Robert is not faithful to Cersei, but are they suggesting that there's things Cersei has done that Robert may be aware of? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Sometimes the question is more compelling than the answer, and whatever you imagine, your headcanon, is just as right as any theory. But here's the best part of the scene, and it tells you so much about Robert.
You want to know the horrible truth? I can't even remember what she looked like.
Some people that have experienced any form of grief may relate to this feeling or fearing you'll forget someone or that your memory doesn't retain every single detail. And at first, you may think this is what Robert is experiencing, but I don't think that's the full picture. Robert and Lyanna's relationship has been distorted by Robert's delusion. When it comes to Lyanna, Robert is delusional. He's basically had this imaginationship with Lyanna, never recognizing that it's unrequited love. When you jump into the source material, there are accounts of Lyanna being moved to tears when Rhaegar Targaryen plays the harp. Yet we can't find anything that demonstrates similar affection from Lyanna to Robert. It's interesting that this is Robert's bride-to-be, whose alleged abduction started a full-out rebellion, and it's never mentioned of her saying anything mutual as far as desire for Robert. In other words, Robert has been projecting this entire time. Robert fell about as hard as anyone can for the idea of Lyanna. It's all he ever wanted, and the whole Seven Kingdoms can't fill the hole that she left behind. I think it's why Robert is always looking for this huge war. He's constantly paranoid about an attack from somewhere. He's distracted by it, and it makes him neglect far more pressing matters. If Lyanna's alleged abduction started the war with the Targaryens, and Robert believes that the Targaryens may try to invade with a foreign army, then this potential threat falls right back into the delusion about Lyanna, and it all goes into that same compartment in Robert's mind. Here's how oblivious Robert is. He didn't know that Lyanna didn't love him, and a big part of it is that he never truly knew her. If he did, he would not have been so appalled by Ned burying her in the crypts at Winterfell. In Ned's chapters, he even considers how little Robert knew Lyanna to himself. Meanwhile, Robert speaks about a single unified army, And he's right about that. But the issue is that you can't just demand that everyone gets along. This is where his negligence sets in. And it's worse because he recognizes that the realm is not unified and he doesn't really do much about it. And he would know better about the various conflicts if he actually participated in those small council meetings, but he doesn't. This situation with Ned being confronted by Jaime is a very big deal. Blood has been shed, Tyrion Lannister has been taken captive by Catelyn, and while this does happen after this scene, it's very obvious that something like this was going to happen. The potential for hostility to occur between the Starks and the Lannisters is obvious. The crown is in significant debt to Tywin Lannister, but a more pressing matter is the debt to the Iron Bank. If Robert is so concerned about a potential rebellion or a foreign invasion, the last thing he needs is the Iron Bank to have motive to fund his enemies. This also allows us to see further neglect when Cersei asks Robert what he wants and he gestures his wine glass. When I say Robert neglects things, it also plays into how he's oblivious to the blatant tension between Ned and Cersei. To side with Cersei with the conflict at the Trident with Arya and Joffrey is a mistake. Having Lady killed to appease Cersei is just Robert's way of avoiding conflict. These small disagreements of minor rivalries that creep up with those around Robert are really what blows up into the War of the Five Kings, but Robert is too focused on the mystery war he assumes awaits them in the future. Even in this scene, you see Cersei expressing herself, basically saying that she did desire him at a time, that she did want him at a time, and yet he's ignored her, he's stonewalled her, he's basically turned her only into an obligation, a political obligation, and that's all, not recognizing that that has created tension from his wife towards himself.
Something different. Your father wants to own the world. Ned Stark wants to run away and bury his head in the snow.
It's a bit of the pot calling the kettle black when Robert says Ned wants to run home and bury his head in the snow, when that is specifically what Robert has been doing. Now, Ned probably should be more transparent with Robert, but Ned doesn't know if he can trust Robert. You could say this isn't Robert's fault, but had Robert been more invested in ruling the realm, there's certain things he wouldn't be oblivious to. And being able to earn the trust from his best friend, Ned Stark, shouldn't be that difficult. The entire time Ned is in King's Landing, he's been investigating Jon Arryn's death, asking a lot of people a lot of questions when Robert just took everything at face value. It's odd that it never occurs to Robert that his children look nothing like him. For someone so paranoid about any potential threats, Robert seems to overlook just about every real threat or conspiracy unfolding in front of his own eyes. Now, I said at the beginning that Robert was right. His thoughts on if Daenerys, or at the time Viserys, invaded King's Landing, they'd all be in a lot of trouble.
They leave us in our castles. They go from town to town, looting and burning, killing every man who can't hide behind a stone wall. How long do the people of the Seven Kingdoms stand behind their absentee king?
Robert from early on is the only one sounding the alarms about the Targaryens coming back, and everyone ignores this. Cersei in this scene does a great job for continuity when later we hear Tywin echo similar statements in a later season.
We still outnumber them.
I find it very interesting that the guy moonlighting as a conspiracy theorist turns out to be right about how serious the threat of a Targaryen can be. And keep in mind, he's only thinking of the Dothraki coming over with the Targaryens. You can imagine the actions Robert would take if he was alive to hear about Daenerys having 3 dragons. Now, I'm not saying that this one scene offers all the context for everything that I'm saying here, but after rewatching Game of Thrones and rereading the book series multiple times, when you go back to this scene, it felt very organic in the show. And to think that this scene was actually written by Dan Benioff and D.B. Weiss just goes to show that at one point, they did know what they were doing. A lot of people think they ran out of source material, but a scene like this that was entirely original suggests otherwise, because they didn't run out of source material, they just simply stopped expanding on it like they did in this scene. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in this next video right here.